Well, all right, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the last talk for B-Sides Las Vegas and the Common Ground for day 2. This is Not So Boring Threat Model of CSP-Managed NHIs by Traxler. So, a few announcements before we begin. We'd like to thank our sponsors, especially our diamond sponsors, Adobe and Aikido, and our gold sponsors, Profit and Run Zero. It's their support, along with other sponsors, donors, and volunteers, that make this event possible. These talks are being streamed live to YouTube, and as a courtesy to our speakers and the audience, we please ask that you check your cell phones to make sure that they're silent. If there's time after the talk, we will open the floor for audience questions, and I will pass the mic around to anybody who wants to ask. And as part of the cell phone policy for B-Sides Las Vegas, we ask that there's no photography during the talk. But with that, I think we'll hand it off to Kat. Take it away. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to the last talk. There will definitely be time for questions because there's nobody after me, so we can just keep going. For everybody who I haven't met yet, my name is Kat Traxler. I'm the principal security researcher at Vector AI. I spend my days and usually nights many turtles deep into cloud service provider architectures, mainly Google Cloud, a little bit AWS, and lately Microsoft, unfortunately. Just in my search for patterns within identity. And I always like to splatter my kind of research philosophy across my About Me page, where I look for kind of the interesting vulnerabilities is where technologies intersect at the boundaries. That's where things are stitched together with awkward protocols, where there's assumptions made with some good intentions, and often things are forgotten, and that's where some juicy things happen. That's where you can find these integrations being stitched together, often with service agents, and that's what this talk is all about. Service agents, service-linked roles, non-human identities, which is kind of the moniker that the industry has picked up. I don't like it, NHIs, but the industry has kind of collected around the term NHIs to describe everything that's not a human user, the identities that are used by background tasks. So that's what this talk is all about. If you scan this link, it will be taken to my link tree, my LinkedIn, my GitHub, my Twitter, all of those kind of socials. So without further ado, let's threat model the cloud. We're going to get into all three clouds, AWS, GCP, and Microsoft, and do a little bit of like who wore it best, a little bit of like comparison architectures through the lens of vulnerabilities, looking at like what unique vulnerabilities show up in each of the clouds. And we're going to say, based off of their architectures, what are they uniquely vulnerable to, and then what are they not uniquely vulnerable to? So a little shout out to Adam Shostak, who kind of came up with this framework for threat modeling. We're going to first ask, what are we working on? We're talking about AWS service linked roles. We're talking about AWS service linked roles, Google service agents, and Microsoft's first party app registrations. Those are like the three resources across all three clouds that we're talking about. Then my goal is to keep you awake until the vulnerability part. Everybody likes the vulnerabilities, so we have to sit through the architecture. Then we get to the vulns. The vulns are about what's uniquely at risk for each of those resource types. And then finally, to wrap it up, what can we do about it? What are the preventative controls that you as a cloud consumer can implement to protect yourself? And then where do you have like zero control on stuff? Okay. We're going to just go through order: AWS, Google Cloud, Microsoft. AWS, Google Cloud, Microsoft. I'm going to go through that specific order. Right up AWS. Service linked roles. What are we not talking about? I'm not talking about AWS users. I'm not talking about plain old AWS roles. These are service linked roles we're talking about. The roles that are used as the roles that are being assumed by the AWS service principals. And there's a few highlights I will point out with this architecture. It has a multi-tenant design, meaning the same identity is used to access multiple customer accounts. And I'm going to use this example over and over again. CloudTrail is an AWS service. The same service principle, is used to access multiple customer accounts. It's a one-to-many relationship. We have a multi-tenant design. It has this hybrid architecture, meaning there's like two different parts of this resource. You have the service principal, which resides in something that's AWS owned, but then there's that role that it gets assumed into your account. So there's these two different parts. There's in two different accounts. And the other feature we want to keep in mind is that it has a locked trust policy. Only that service principal can assume the role. When these are automatically created in the background, they're not automatically granted permissions. You have to grant them those policies. Okay, moving on. What the hell? What's
Interrupted.
Oh my God.
Only kidding.
M&Ms?
Yes, for brown M&Ms in your speaker request.
Did I ask for brown M? I did, didn't I? I was feeling super bougie. Wow.
Anyway, thank you so much. We
Wow,
appreciate
thank
being here.
you. Thank you for paying attention to my bougie request. I was feeling like very Van Halen at the moment. Thank you so much. Do you want some?
I would absolutely take an M&M
Okay,
with you.
okay, thank you. Just, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think it is Eddie Van Halen who,
The great philosopher.
yeah, who always had that in their rider whenever they traveled, that they had to have their green room filled with brown M&Ms. And I was like, am I at that level?
You have
It
arrived.
turns out I am.
You have arrived. And we're grateful to have you here.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Google Service Agents. What are we not talking about? We're not talking about Google users. We're not talking about your Gmail account. When you're in your Google project, you can create service accounts. We're not talking about those resources. These are service agents. These are service accounts, but they're owned by Google Cloud. This whole talk is about CSP-Managed NHIs. So these are the resources that the cloud service provider is managing for yourself. Some highlights about the architecture. As opposed to AWS, it's single tenant. The same principle is not accessing multiple tenants. It actually has this moniker per project, per product, meaning there's a new principle created for every project and every product, right? Completely different than the AWS model. Single tenant. It's completely provider controlled. That resource is completely living within a Google managed tenant. And unfortunately, it has birthright permissions. When you create a service in Google, it automatically is assigning them some fairly high powered permissions. And last but not least, we have our Microsoft first-party app registrations. We're not talking about the apps you create. We're not talking about managed identities. We're not talking about users. We're talking about the apps that Microsoft creates that live in Microsoft tenants that then are automatically installed in your tenant. Your Entra ID tenant, you automatically create one. There's a whole bunch of default apps that you consume from SharePoint to O365, and then you're gonna get some local service principles associated with that. Let's compare them to AWS and GCP. Like AWS, it's going to have that multi-tenant design. So that same first-party principle is going to act in a whole bunch of different tenants. You're going to see that same GUID. You can track that from tenant to tenant to tenant. It's looking pretty similar to AWS. And again, it has that hybrid architecture. So in that Microsoft-controlled tenant, it's that app registration. But then as a consumer, you're going to have that associated service principal. It's like two parts to the same identity. And then you'll have your role bindings within Entra ID or Azure from there. Okay. We got through the architecture piece. We have a little background. Some of them are multi-tenant, some are single tenant. Some of them are like wholly living within a managed tenant. Some of them are kind of like hybrid. Let's look at some vulnerabilities that are unique to each one of these implementations. So what's AWS uniquely vulnerable to? And this multi-tenant architecture is uniquely vulnerable to a type of, oh gosh, 10 minutes. I'm so glad I'm the last talk of the day. It's uniquely vulnerable to a type of confused deputy attack. AWS calls this a cross-service attack, but basically what happens is when you say allow a service principal to write to your bucket, classic example is going to be CloudTrail. You're going to let CloudTrail write some logs to your bucket. You're going to allow CloudTrail, that service principal, that global service principal. It's then going to be allowed by thousands of customers, that global principal. An attacker, somebody with malicious intent, if they know the name of your bucket, they could then write logs to your bucket. They could direct their log output to your bucket for nefarious means. It's kind of a simple and dumb explanation, but it's a natural consequence of this multi-tenant architecture. Are the other clouds vulnerable? Google Cloud, definitely not vulnerable. They go with the single tenant approach. Microsoft, maybe. They have a multi-tenant architecture, so it makes sense that they would be, but nobody's done research into it. And if this piques your curiosity, I encourage you to go and check it out. Now on to Google. Google has single tenant architecture. But it's still vulnerable to a type of confused deputy attack. This one's really more of a privilege escalation issue because service agents are given these like automatic birthright permissions. They often have like really high-powered admin permissions. And when you couple that with, say, a document writing service, you could then maybe manipulate that service to read or write from a bucket that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. So let's say you don't have permissions to read and write from a bucket, but the service agent does, and you can leverage that to then take actions that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. It's a type of confused deputy. It happens within your own project, really more of a privilege escalation issue. Are the other clouds vulnerable? Not really in AWS. They kind of mitigate it in a way that we as a community have accepted. They use this type of permission called pass role that's going to kind of like mark that issue and say, we understand this is privilege escalation. We're going to require you to have an extra permission to do it. So kind of colloquially, we've all assumed that this is like preventative control. Again, big, huge question mark with Microsoft. We don't know. The architecture suggests that it absolutely would be. Nobody's looked at it. So I hope this is going to like inspire some Microsoft researchers. I don't volunteer, but please, somebody go and look at this because their architecture would suggest that they would be vulnerable. And finally, in the absolute wildest attack known is service principal hijacking. And this has been known for like 5 or 6 years. It's been talked about for a while. The local service principal associated with Microsoft's first-party applications, you can actually add a local long-term credential to that service principal. You and me could then authenticate as that service principal and use the permissions it was assigned in a birthright scenario. So this is like a great privilege escalation technique. You and me can authenticate as the O365 service or the SharePoint service through this technique. It's an absolutely wild thing coming from a non-Microsoft background to think about that. And are the other clouds vulnerable to this type of attack? No way. You cannot add long-term durable credentials in AWS. And you cannot add long-term durable credentials in Google Cloud. You couldn't even generate short-term credentials. Like this is a very specific Microsoft thing. Okay, in our last section, what can we do about it? Or really, what can anybody do about these inherent vulnerabilities to non-human identities. Whether this is a concern or not, preventing these is not always entirely up to you. Only in AWS can you actually positively prevent these issues, and that's because AWS allows you to add these condition keys. Remember how I said that the issue in AWS arises when these global multi-tenant service principals are allowed to, read or write to buckets? Well, you can actually add these condition keys that say, well, yes, CloudTrail, go ahead and write logs to my bucket, but only when coming from my account, or only when being invoked from this known organization, not from some silly unknown organization. So in Microsoft, you can actually positively prevent that. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have Google. There are no preventative controls to prevent this confused deputy attack. If you're able to manipulate a service agent to perform an action that you personally don't have permissions to do, this is a vulnerability. Google recognizes it as a vulnerability, and please report it to them. Only they're positioned to then implement a check. They can implement a caller check that says, does the caller have those permissions? What it's asking the service agent to do? Only they can implement it. And I would say it's up for debate on whether or not allowing the cloud service provider to have these controls, or whether or not you'd rather, as a customer, have the controls. Which one's better? I'm not sure. And finally, Microsoft. And I truly try not to have this presentation just about picking on Microsoft, but they really do kind of lay an egg on this comparison. There is a preventative control that could prevent you from adding a long-term durable credential. It's called the App Instance Property Lock. Unfortunately, only as the application publisher can you add this prevention. So only Microsoft could add this prevention as the publisher of the first-party app registration. They have not consistently done this. They've done that to some applications. However, some really critical ones they have not. So there's nothing you can do currently to positively prevent this type of privilege escalation, say through O365 SharePoint. I have a white paper coming out in maybe a week or so on this issue with tons of references and links of people much smarter than me talking about this issue, and it's been going back for years and years and years. So there's a lot of documentation on this privilege escalation technique and how Microsoft hasn't really closed the loop on it. So what have we learned? Have we learned anything in this threat modeling exercise besides just cynicism and existential dread? Maybe. We have some best practices in design. This slide is for the cloud service providers. If you're listening, if AWS, the holy trifecta of AWS, GCP, and Azure, if anybody shows up and sees this, these are some best practices. We want single tenant NHIs. We don't want these multi-tenant. This leads to just a growing impact when things go wrong. We want zero birthright permissions. Only AWS does this correct. And we want that resource to be wholly controlled within the CSP tenant. We don't want bits and pieces within the control of the customer, AKA a malicious actor. Google's doing this right. This slide is for you and me. This is what we can do. And unfortunately, as far as preventative controls are talked about, only in the AWS world can we do anything with conditions keys on our resource policies saying, hey, global service principal, you can act on a resource, but only when coming from these specific accounts or organizations. In Google Cloud and Microsoft, detective controls are your best friend. And finally, this kind of comparison threat model would not be complete if I didn't have a little hot take grading. Far and away, I gotta say, with this kind of grading, Google Cloud's got to be doing it the best. They have single tenant architecture. They have preventative control. The preventative controls are squarely on the side of the CSPs. So you as a consumer don't have to do anything. It's up to them to do something about it. The only knock I'd give them is they have this excessive birthright issue, which I guess would also lead to the fact that it's really easy to use. It's a very easy to use platform. Next up, we have AWS, amazing, zero birthright permissions. But unfortunately, they have this multi-tenant architecture, which increases the impact and the blast radius when you do have issues. And then the mitigations, that's on the shoulders and the backs of the customers. And just really, really shit in the bed here is Microsoft. I'm sorry, but like automatically assign permissions, multi-tenant architectures. There's no preventative controls that you can do to prevent this. This is all on Microsoft, and they haven't been doing what they need to do. So I think I'm pretty generous in giving them a D in this. But everybody has some work to do, honestly. If you enjoyed this talk, just wait for like a 20-page white paper to come out on this if you really want to like get into the architectures and the different types of attacks and preventative controls and detective controls. And that's all I got. Do we have time for a question? One question, okay. Oh, Sean.
I need to give you the microphone.
We need it for the stream.
So, are you, and this is a question, are you opinionated in like a multi-cloud environment? Like which one of these providers you would base as a primary identity? Because every single one, like all the big three that you have right there is like they have built into their platforms ways to federate that identity on other ends of the platform. So AWS, same with Google Cloud versus Azure. Like, what are some questions that you would like the audience to think about when selecting primary identity? Which is the primary identity, and which is you're going to federate, and where you're going to federate it out?
That's like a bigger question beyond the scope of this talk, because I think the scope of the talk is really on the CSP-Managed NHIs, the ones that you don't get to choose. You're showing up and using a cloud, and there's all sorts of background identities created for you, and you don't have a choice to federate them. There's some inherent risk in those background identities. The question you're talking about is more like, what's your like decision around your enterprise directory, right? And like, I think unfortunately people don't have a lot of choice in that. I think a lot of enterprises show up and they're like, we're a Microsoft shop, Bob bought the E5s, and that's just how this is going. So your question, if all things were equal, my answer would be different, but the realities of the game are like, what your enterprise directory is not based on like design decisions of the identity provider. It's based around what Bob in accounting decided. And like, you just got to run with that.
Thank you.
I'm a practical person.
Hey.
With a bag of brown M&Ms. All right, anything else? Cool. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you.